In the twilight of imperial Russia, behind the gilded walls of palaces and the shimmering opulence of royal life, lived four sisters whose stories would echo through history not just as royalty, but as symbols of resilience, mystery, and tragedy. Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia Romanov were more than grand duchesses. They were daughters, caregivers, dreamers, and quiet witnesses to the collapse of a dynasty. Their lives, so full of promise, were marked by the sweeping tides of revolution and the relentless march of fate. Though their time on earth was brief, their legacy continues to captivate the world, inviting us to uncover the truth behind the legends and understand the human hearts behind the royal titles. Welcome to Words of Time, and in this video, we'll take you on a deeply moving journey through the legacy of the Romanov sisters, exploring the enduring mysteries surrounding their deaths, the cultural and historical impact they left behind, and why their story remains so important in understanding the fall of the Russian Empire. Let's begin. In the twilight of imperial Russia, amid the opulence of palaces and the shadow of revolution, four sisters stood as living emblems of beauty, grace, and the tragic fragility of power. The daughters of Tsar Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna, Grand Duchesses Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia Romanov were born into a world steeped in grandeur and tradition. As Romanovs, their lives unfolded within the confines of a court that still clung to the divine right of kings, even as the modern world pressed insistently at the gates of the Winter Palace. Though history often reduces them to tragic figures whose lives were brutally cut short in a Yekaterinburg cellar in 1918, the sisters lived full lives, each with distinct personalities and aspirations, deeply interwoven with the fate of their family and the collapsing empire around them. Their childhood was marked by an extraordinary juxtaposition of privilege and seclusion. Raised in the opulent imperial residences of Tsarskoye Selo and Levadia, the four sisters, collectively referred to as OTMA, a monogram formed from the initials of their first names, lived in surroundings that most could only dream of. Yet their parents, especially Empress Alexandra, sought to instill in them a sense of humility, religious devotion, and discipline. Their bedrooms were modest by royal standards, and they slept on hard camp beds, bathed in cold water, and were taught to sew and clean. The girls were educated by private tutors in languages, history, literature, music, and the arts. French and English were spoken fluently, and their conversations were often peppered with a hybrid of these tongues, a reflection of their cosmopolitan upbringing. Despite being daughters of the autocrat of all the Russia, their world was intentionally insulated from the excesses of imperial indulgence, largely due to Alexandra's deep religious convictions and desire to shield them from the more frivolous temptations of court life. Yet, insulated though they were, they could not be separated from the power they represented. As Grand Duchesses, they were symbols of imperial continuity, particularly in a dynasty increasingly desperate for a male heir. The birth of Tsarevich Alexei in 1904 after the four girls was both a personal relief for their parents and a national event of enormous consequence. The sisters' roles shifted as their younger brother's frailty became apparent. Alexei suffered from hemophilia, a condition that demanded near-constant care and secrecy. The girls became his protectors, companions, and in many ways, emotional caregivers. The illness of the heir forged a tighter bond among the siblings, and the sisters often organized their lives around his condition. In private letters and diaries, they expressed genuine love and affection for Alexei, mingled with a sense of duty that weighed heavily on them. Within the broader context of court life, the sisters had a unique, though constrained, influence. They were expected to maintain the dignity and decorum befitting their station, attending official functions, engaging in charitable activities, and presenting an image of imperial stability. Tatiana, the second sister, often acted as a de facto substitute for her mother, organizing hospital work and writing formal letters. Olga, the eldest, was known for her introspection and melancholy, often writing poetry and reflecting on the burdens of her status. Maria, with her kind-hearted nature and romantic disposition, was said to long for a family of her own, while Anastasia, the youngest, was spirited and mischievous, known for her practical jokes and quick wit. Despite their varying personalities, what united them was a shared sense of duty, a deep loyalty to each other, and an awareness, sometimes vague, sometimes painfully acute, of their roles as living representations of a dynasty under siege. As they matured into young women, the sisters began to participate more actively in the ceremonial and social functions of the court. But the Russian court, particularly under the influence of Empress Alexandra, had grown increasingly insular. Alexandra's withdrawal from public life, driven by ill health, her son's condition, and her reliance on the mystic Grigory Rasputin, meant the Grand Duchesses were rarely thrust into the limelight in the way other European royals might have been. The empress, deeply suspicious of the corrupting influences of court society, kept her daughters close and their social circles narrow. Prospects of marriage to foreign princes, once a certainty for royal daughters, began to dim. Political instability, war, and the growing unpopularity of the Romanovs made alliances with Russia less attractive to other European powers. Yet even within these limits, the sisters found ways to assert themselves and shape their identities. During World War I, Olga and Tatiana trained as nurses and worked in military hospitals alongside their mother. The war offered them a chance to step beyond the ceremonial roles expected of imperial women and engage directly with the suffering of their people. The brutality of their experiences treating wounded soldiers, witnessing death on a near-daily basis, left a profound mark on them. Maria and Anastasia, too young to serve as nurses, visited hospitals, helped distribute aid, and kept spirits high with their humor and charm. The war years, while devastating for the empire, allowed the sisters a fleeting glimpse of purposeful agency. They were no longer just ornaments of royalty but participants in a nation's collective trauma. Their wartime service earned them admiration from those who encountered them firsthand. Though the broader public remained largely unaware, their images still shaped by distance and propaganda. Their influence in political affairs was virtually non-existent by design. Nicholas II, though a devoted father, remained an autocrat reluctant to share power or consider the modernizing impulses sweeping Europe. Alexandra, meanwhile, wielded greater influence behind the scenes, often relying on Rasputin for spiritual guidance and political advice. The sisters, for all their proximity, were more observers than participants in these matters. Nonetheless, their letters and diaries reveal an awareness of the growing unrest and their family's precarious position. Olga, in particular, expressed disillusionment and fear in her later writings, sensing the inevitable collapse of the old order. Yet loyalty to their parents kept them from questioning too deeply or openly rebelling against the insulated world they had been raised in. What the sisters did influence profoundly and tragically was the humanization of the Romanov family. In a time when monarchy was increasingly seen as an archaic institution, the Grand Duchesses brought a tangible warmth and relatability to the imperial image. Their photographs, taken informally and with great frequency, captured moments of laughter, intimacy, and youthful exuberance. Whether sailing at Levadia, walking with their dogs, or posing in homemade costumes, these images offered rare glimpses into the private lives of royalty. In an age before Instagram, their amateur snapshots and candid portraits softened the aura of power that clung to the Romanov name. They were not distant porcelain icons but real young women with hopes, dreams, and fears. Their destiny, however, was shaped by forces far beyond their control. The revolution of 1917 swept away the centuries-old Romanov dynasty, and the family's world contracted rapidly. From the opulent halls of the Alexander Palace, they were moved into captivity, first at the governor's mansion in Tobolsky and then at the Ipatov house in Ekaterinburg. Even in confinement, the sisters remained dignified and close-knit, continuing their daily routines, sewing, reading, and caring for their brother. Their spirits remarkably did not break. Witnesses and guards often remarked on their composure, kindness, and grace under pressure. They shared chores, played games, and tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, even as the shadow of execution loomed ever closer. In those final months, the strength of the bond between the sisters and their brother became even more apparent. Their devotion to Alexei remained unwavering, with each sister taking turns to entertain, comfort, and care for him as his health declined. Their affection was not performative but deeply embedded in their daily lives, offering both him and themselves a sense of stability amid chaos. They were no longer Grand Duchesses but sisters and daughters clinging to each other in the face of erasure. The story of Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia Romanov endures not merely because of the tragic end they met, but because of the way they lived navigating the tension between immense privilege and increasing vulnerability, between the ceremonial expectations of royalty and their own private identities. They lived in a world that both venerated and imprisoned them, where their every movement was scrutinized and their futures dictated by forces they could not control. Yet within that world they found space, however limited, to love deeply, to serve with compassion, and to carry themselves with dignity. Their influence may not have been political, but it was deeply human. In remembering the Romanov sisters, history is invited to see not just the fall of an empire, but the faces of 4 young women who bore the weight of a dying dynasty with astonishing grace. In the end, they were not just figures in a royal tragedy, they were daughters, sisters, caregivers, patriots, and individuals whose lives still resonate, not for the crowns they wore, but for the humanity they so vividly embodied. Behind the shimmering veil of imperial grandeur that cloaked the Romanov dynasty, The private lives of Grand Duchesses Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia remained largely hidden from the public eye, obscured by the rituals of court and the political maelstrom swirling around their family. Yet within the high walls of the Alexander Palace and the marble corridors of imperial residences, the four daughters of Tsar Nicholas II lived not as distant figures of royalty alone but as passionate, intelligent, sensitive young women who longed for love, struggled with expectations, embraced beauty, and faced tragedy with a quiet strength that continues to captivate generations. Their lives, bound by the constraints of royalty, were shaped by secret desires, silent sacrifices, and a constant negotiation between who they were expected to be and who they truly were. Among the most poignant elements of their hidden lives were the quiet stirrings of the heart, the secret love affairs, tender crushes, and unspoken longings that offered rare glimpses into their emotional worlds. Living in the shadow of strict protocol, where every interaction with outsiders was measured and scrutinized, the sisters found themselves in an environment where genuine emotional expression was often curbed. Still, even in such a controlled atmosphere, the heart found ways to assert itself. Olga, the eldest, perhaps bore the deepest emotional scars in this realm. Sensitive, introspective, and often weighed down by the responsibilities of her position, Olga was said to have fallen in love more than once. Her wartime service in military hospitals exposed her to young officers whose bravery and charisma captured her attention. One figure in particular, Officer Dmitry Shakebagos, was believed to have sparked a deep emotional attachment. Though no formal engagement was ever announced, and any potential relationship was swiftly discouraged by the Empress, Olga's letters and demeanor during this period hinted at a quiet heartbreak. Rumors of her affection for another officer, Pavel Voronov, also emerged, and her diary entries during this time were filled with melancholy reflections, thinly veiled by poetic musings. Tatiana, regal and composed, also experienced emotional attachments during the war years, when she worked as a Red Cross nurse and found herself in close proximity to wounded soldiers. One such figure, Dmitry Malima, became the subject of admiration and possibly affection. Gifted with a French bulldog named Ortino from Malima, Tatiana treasured both the dog and the connection it symbolized. Unlike Olga's more overt emotional introspection, Tatiana's feelings were guarded, filtered through a lens of responsibility and devotion to her mother. She was perceived as the most dutiful daughter, frequently acting as Alexandra's secretary and confidant. Yet those who knew her closely sensed a depth of feeling beneath her poised surface, a longing for a life not confined by duty or dynastic expectations. Maria, warm and affectionate, possessed a natural sweetness and an unpretentious beauty that made her especially popular with the imperial guards and soldiers. Her open, romantic nature led to numerous flirtations, though nothing that could be called a formal relationship. Her diaries revealed a yearning for marriage and motherhood, dreams that felt increasingly distant as the political turmoil in Russia deepened. Anastasia, the youngest, was often seen as the family's clown, full of mischief and laughter, but even she harbored emotional needs that went largely unspoken. Her relationships remained lighthearted, often expressed in teasing banter with guards or affectionate letters, but her early death at just 17 denied her the chance to grow into the romantic identity she may have longed to explore. All of the sisters were subject to the rigid expectations of court etiquette, where love matches were rarely considered, and marriages were political instruments rather than personal choices. The idea of a Grand Duchess marrying for love, especially a commoner or a military officer, was almost unthinkable in Romanov circles. Yet as the sisters matured during a time of crumbling empires and shifting values, their desires clashed increasingly with these age-old customs. The secrecy surrounding their emotional lives was not just a matter of personal discretion, but a consequence of living in a world that treated royal daughters as state property rather than autonomous beings. Their hidden romances, unfulfilled or quietly extinguished, represent a poignant dimension of their identities, youthful longings suffocated by dynastic obligations and looming catastrophe. Equally intertwined with their identity was the power of their beauty and the understated yet significant influence they exerted on fashion and aesthetics within the imperial court. From a young age, the Romanov sisters were regarded as symbols of grace and charm. In official photographs and informal snapshots alike, they exuded a natural elegance that captivated those around them. Their beauty was not the ostentatious variety often associated with royalty, but something quieter, more genuine, refined by simplicity, modesty, and a sense of personal authenticity. Olga, with her soulful eyes and pensive expression, projected an air of quiet melancholy. Tatiana was often described as the most majestic in appearance, tall, dignified, with aristocratic features and a natural grace that made her seem born to rule. Maria's soft features, expressive eyes, and endearing smile made her the epitome of classical beauty, while Anastasia's impish charm and animated expressions brought a lively energy to the group. Their influence on court fashion, though subtle, was undeniable. The sisters favored clean lines, soft colors, and modest silhouettes, often favoring white dresses with pastel sashes, lace blouses, and wide-brimmed hats. Their style was shaped in part by their mother's English sensibilities and her preference for modesty and restraint. Empress Alexandra rejected the excessive opulence that had previously defined the Romanov court, instead cultivating an image of domestic virtue and spiritual focus. As such, her daughters were rarely seen in extravagant jewelry or the heavily embellished gowns worn by earlier generations. Their fashion choices reflected not only the empress's preferences but also the girls' own personalities, practical, demure, and unpretentious. During World War I, their role as nurses further shifted their appearance. Olga and Tatiana, in particular, adopted the uniforms of the Red Cross, their long hair tucked under simple veils, their faces stripped of makeup. Yet even in their hospital attire, they retained an air of refinement. Their very presence among the wounded elevated the morale of patients and staff, not only because of their imperial status but because of their genuine compassion and quiet dignity. Photographs from this period show the sisters immersed in their work, dressed simply yet radiating a kind of noble strength. These images, circulated quietly at the time and more widely in later years, contributed to a mythos that blended beauty, tragedy, and resilience in equal measure. Beyond fashion and aesthetics, the Romanov sisters helped redefine what it meant to be royal women in the modern age. Though their public roles were limited, the authenticity of their presence resonated with those who encountered them. They offered an image of royalty that was less distant and more human, a blend of grace, labor, and emotional depth. Their photographs, journals, and letters gave the world not just stylized portraits of young duchesses, but real, breathing individuals shaped by the pressures of history and the quiet battles of the heart. As their lives unfolded, however, they could not remain untouched by the darker forces surrounding their family. Chief among these was the mysterious and controversial figure of Grigory Rasputin. His presence cast a long shadow over the Romanovs, and his assassination in 1916 sent tremors through the household that reverberated with tragic finality. Rasputin's influence, particularly over Empress Alexandra, was a source of immense controversy. Believed to possess healing powers that could alleviate the suffering of the hemophiliac Tsarevich Alexei, Rasputin gained unparalleled access to the imperial family. To the outside world, he was an evil mystic, a manipulative charlatan who wielded disproportionate power. To Alexandra and by extension, her daughters, he was a spiritual guide and a savior. The Romanov sisters' relationship with Rasputin was complex. They were taught to revere him, to regard him as a holy man whose prayers and blessings brought peace to their brother. Letters from the sisters to Rasputin convey affection and trust, referring to him as our friend, and expressing gratitude for his support. Yet these same letters, once leaked or intercepted, became fodder for scandal, misinterpreted by outsiders as evidence of inappropriate closeness or impropriety. In truth, the sisters' interactions with Rasputin were born of desperation and belief, not scandal. Still, the perception of impropriety fueled by court gossip, political opponents, and sensationalist journalism further eroded public confidence in the monarchy. Rasputin's murder at the hands of nobles, including Prince Felix Yusupov and Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, was both a personal and political earthquake for the Romanovs. For the sisters, it was the loss of a man they believed had safeguarded their brother's life. Their reactions were characterized by grief, confusion, and fear for what his absence would mean for Alexei's fragile health. Rasputin's death also symbolized a dangerous unraveling of control. If even the so-called friend of the empress could be violently dispatched by elements within the nobility, what did that say about the security of the throne, or the loyalty of the court? In the months that followed, the Romanovs' world collapsed rapidly. The February Revolution of 1917 forced Nicholas II to renounce, and the family was placed under house arrest. In the wake of Rasputin's death and the Tsar's fall, the sisters bore witness to the dismantling of the only life they had ever known. And yet, in captivity, their strength did not falter. They remained close, supportive of their parents and brother, and composed even in the face of uncertainty and hardship. The assassination of Rasputin, once seen as a desperate measure to save the empire, had only hastened its fall. And for the Romanov sisters, it marked the beginning of their final chapter, a chapter defined not by jewels and gowns, but by courage, loyalty, and an enduring, tragic grace. In reflecting on their hidden lives, it becomes clear that the Romanov sisters were far more than mere figures of history. They were young women who dreamed of love, who dressed not for spectacle but for self-expression, and who lived under the long and often cruel shadow of a fate they did not choose. Their hidden romances speak of a yearning for connection. Their style and presence shaped the aesthetic memory of an era. And their suffering in the wake of Rasputin's murder and the empire's collapse reveals the depth of their resilience. To unveil their hidden lives is not only to bring light to the corners history often neglects but to remember them not simply as victims of revolution, but as individuals who lived and loved deeply, beautifully, and courageously in a world slipping away. Within the gilded confines of the Russian imperial court, the Romanov sisters Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia were born into a life shaped by ceremony, expectation, and centuries-old tradition. As daughters of Tsar Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna, they were raised in an environment that emphasized duty, religious devotion, and dynastic preservation. Yet beyond the polished floors of their palaces and the tightly managed rituals of court life, these young women demonstrated a profound and sincere connection to the world outside, one that extended beyond their roles as Grand Duchesses. Their lives, often misrepresented as sheltered or detached, reveal a growing engagement with the needs of their country, a quietly unfolding social consciousness, and a willingness to look beyond privilege and into the human struggles that surrounded them. Their philanthropic efforts, their subtle push toward progress, and their experiences of travel and cultural exchange provided them with a unique vantage point that, had history granted them more time, might have positioned them as significant voices for change in a rapidly transforming Russia. From a young age, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia were encouraged to participate in charitable efforts, not merely as symbolic gestures of royalty, but as genuine expressions of compassion and Christian duty. Their mother, deeply religious and heavily influenced by the values of Queen Victoria's court, instilled in them the belief that the truest form of nobility lay not in grandeur, but in service to others. This sentiment found practical form as the sisters became involved in various philanthropic endeavors, especially during the First World War. As the war reshaped Russian society and left countless families grieving and impoverished, the Romanov sisters did not retreat into isolation but instead stepped forward, taking active roles in hospitals, aid organizations, and charitable campaigns designed to bring relief to the suffering. Olga and Tatiana, the two eldest, trained as nurses with the Russian Red Cross and served in military hospitals established near the imperial residences. Far from a ceremonial presence, they learned to administer bandages, assist with surgeries, clean wounds, and provide emotional comfort to soldiers broken by war. Letters from patients and doctors who worked alongside them testified to the sincerity of their labor. Olga, sensitive and intuitive, often formed close bonds with wounded men, offering them not just physical care but spiritual and emotional solace. Tatiana, more reserved but equally committed, displayed a calm authority that earned her the nickname, the governess, from the soldiers and staff. These were not easy tasks. The sisters were frequently exposed to gruesome injuries, the stench of death, and the haunting despair of war-torn lives. Yet they persevered with quiet dignity, never seeking acclaim but determined to serve. Maria and Anastasia, though too young at the beginning of the war to be certified nurses, also found ways to contribute. They visited wounded soldiers, assisted in collecting and organizing medical supplies, and volunteered in convalescent homes. Maria, with her open heart and nurturing demeanor, was often found chatting with patients, lifting their spirits through warmth and kindness. Anastasia, mischievous and lively, brought humor into the bleak hospital halls, sometimes reading aloud, performing impromptu skits, or simply sitting with those too weary to speak. Their involvement was not limited to the hospitals. During peacetime, all four sisters took part in numerous charitable drives. They distributed gifts to orphanages, visited homes for the disabled, and helped organize bazaars to raise funds for the needy. These efforts were not showpieces arranged for the sake of publicity. They were deeply personal undertakings that brought the Grand Duchesses into direct contact with people far outside their social class. Through these experiences, the Romanov sisters began to see Russia in all its complexity, not just the glittering court of St. Petersburg, but the villages ravaged by poverty, the soldiers returning from the front with missing limbs, the orphans staring into an uncertain future. Though their public role was tightly controlled, there were signs that the sisters, particularly Olga and Tatiana, began to question the structures around them. Olga, especially, was known for her emotional depth and intellectual curiosity. Her letters and diaries reveal a mind troubled by inequality, by the weight of war, and by the growing discontent among the people. She confided in trusted aides and family members her concern that her father's government was out of touch with the suffering of ordinary Russians. She sometimes clashed with her parents, particularly when she voiced opinions that hinted at a more democratic or reform-minded worldview. Tatiana, though more reserved, was not without her own insights. As her role within the household matured, she began to take on responsibilities that mirrored those of a young empress in training. Her organizational skills, sense of responsibility and clear-eyed perspective made her a pillar of strength for her mother. Yet even within that role, Tatiana showed signs of moral complexity. Her wartime work and letters suggest she, too, recognized the deep divides within Russian society and the need for reform. The war had exposed many truths that the walls of the palace had long concealed. Soldiers returned disillusioned. Cities were gripped by hunger. Revolt simmered beneath the surface. 4 young women raised to believe in the divine right of monarchy. These revelations were disquieting, and yet the sisters did not turn away. The possibility of the Romanov sisters emerging as advocates for change is one of the most tantalizing what-ifs in Imperial Russian history. They had the education, the empathy, and the platform to influence hearts and minds. While they never engaged in political discourse publicly restrained both by custom and the watchful eye of their parents, the seeds of social awareness had been planted. They were part of a generation of women across Europe who were beginning to think differently about gender roles, societal obligations, and the power of the individual voice. In Britain and Germany, princesses were taking up causes, supporting suffrage, and using their status to champion reform. It is not inconceivable to imagine that, had the empire endured, Olga or Tatiana might have become prominent figures in shaping a more modern vision of Russian monarchy, one rooted in compassion and service, rather than divine entitlement. Much of the sisters' expanding worldviews also came from their travels beyond the Russian court. Though their journeys were relatively limited compared to the wide-ranging tours of earlier Romanovs, they did spend time abroad, particularly in the early years before war and revolution curtailed such activities. They visited Lavadia in the Crimea, which became a beloved retreat, offering both respite and an opportunity to interact with people in a less formal setting. They traveled to Romania, Germany, and even made brief visits to the Imperial Yacht Stand Arts anchorage in foreign waters. These voyages introduced them to cultures, customs, and landscapes vastly different from their own. In Germany, they encountered a society that, while also monarchist, was more industrialized and modern in its organization. In Romania, they witnessed the challenges of a smaller, more rural kingdom grappling with its own political and social upheavals. What stood out during these travels was how the Romanov sisters, despite their upbringing, exhibited genuine curiosity and humility. They did not carry themselves with haughty arrogance, but rather absorbed the people and places around them with open eyes. Their impressions, preserved in letters and journals, often highlight the contrast between Russia's vast yet impoverished countryside and the more progressive systems observed elsewhere. Tatiana, especially, was impressed by the orderly nature of foreign administrations and the efficiency of military hospitals abroad. Olga, ever the reflective soul, wrote with a kind of longing about places where the nobility and the people seemed more closely connected, less separated by the rigid hierarchies that defined the Russian court. Travel also offered a rare taste of anonymity. On the Standard, away from the confines of palace life, the sisters could behave more freely. They played games with the crew, swam in the sea, dined informally with their parents, and laughed without fear of being observed. These moments, while fleeting, gave them a sense of the world as it might be without titles or ceremony. They saw landscapes untouched by revolution, spoke to people unafraid to express their views, and glimpsed a life that was simpler but perhaps more honest. These experiences left their mark. The contrast between the freedom of their travels and the mounting unrest at home deepened their awareness of Russia's fragile condition. Despite all this, they were never allowed to fully explore their potential as reformers or advocates. Their youth, combined with the protective environment enforced by Alexandra, meant that their voices were often muted or redirected into private correspondence rather than public discourse. Still, their actions, especially during the war, spoke volumes. They chose service over leisure. They chose compassion over comfort. They broke with the illusion that imperial daughters were to remain merely ornamental. In doing so, they became symbols of a monarchy trying, however imperfectly, to adapt to a changing world. Had the revolution not extinguished their lives so brutally, the Romanov sisters might have evolved into leaders for a new era of monarchy, figures who bridged the gap between old-world traditions and emerging modern values. Their compassion, dignity, and insight hinted at a readiness for change, even if that change was not fully understood or embraced in their time. The loss of their lives in Ekaterinburg was not only a personal tragedy but a historical silencing of the potential for a monarchy reimagined, for philanthropy elevated to activism, and for young women who had learned to see beyond their gilded walls to help shape a better world. The Romanov sisters were neither distant aristocrats nor naive girls untouched by reality. They were complex, evolving individuals whose hidden strengths only emerged more fully as their world began to fall apart. Through charity they reached the suffering. Through quiet acts of rebellion they questioned the structures around them. Through travel they saw that the world was broader than the view from a palace window. And through their shared suffering, they stood not only as daughters of a fallen dynasty, but as young women whose compassion, courage, and humanity endured beyond the walls that once confined them. The final chapter in the lives of the Romanov sisters Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia unfolded against the backdrop of a Russia teetering on the edge of transformation. Their world, once defined by the steady rhythm of palace life, elegant rituals, and the invincibility of imperial authority, began to unravel under the weight of political unrest, war, and the growing discontent of a suffering population. As daughters of Tsar Nicholas II, the last emperor of Russia, the Grand Duchesses were born into the center of absolute power. But as the country around them edged toward revolution, they were pulled into a tide of events that neither their status nor their innocence could protect them from. The story of their final years is not only a narrative of personal tragedy, but also a portrait of the emotional and psychological journey of four young women witnessing the end of a world they had always known. The seeds of unrest had been growing in Russia long before the Romanov sisters could have understood their meaning. As children, they were sheltered from the full weight of political tensions, insulated by layers of protocol and palace life. But even from behind the walls of the Alexander Palace, signs of discontent could not be entirely hidden. There were whispers among servants, abrupt changes in court security, and occasional glimpses of protests in the distance. The sisters' early awareness of Russia's unrest came in fragments: conversations halted when they entered the room, stern discussions between their parents, or subtle shifts in the tone of public ceremonies. Their mother, Empress Alexandra, increasingly withdrawn and reliant on the mystic Grigory Rasputin, kept the girls close, instilling in them a belief in divine monarchy and the righteousness of their father's rule. Yet as they matured, especially during the years of the First World War, it became increasingly difficult for them to ignore the truth. The country was in crisis. By the time the war reached its height, Olga and Tatiana had taken on active roles as nurses in military hospitals. This immersion in the suffering of wounded soldiers brought them face to face with the human cost of imperial policy and military mismanagement. They saw men broken not only in body but in spirit, angry and disillusioned, no longer filled with the loyalty that once came naturally to Russian subjects. Letters and journals written by the sisters during these years reveal a growing awareness of the chasm between the world of the palace and the experiences of ordinary Russians. Olga, especially, struggled emotionally with the contradictions she perceived. Known for her introspective nature, she expressed sadness and confusion at the bitterness she encountered in the soldiers she treated. Tatiana, ever the dutiful one, maintained a composed exterior, but even she could not help but notice the tension and growing resentment. The sisters also became increasingly aware of the hostility toward Rasputin, a figure whose influence over their mother was widely condemned. While they had known him as a gentle presence, someone who prayed with them, who seemed to calm their mother's anxiety, and who was credited with helping their brother Alexei during his dangerous episodes of hemophilia, the public saw him as a symbol of corruption. His murder in 1916 shook the family deeply. The event was not just a personal loss, but a symbolic blow to the fragile authority of the Romanovs. In the immediate aftermath, the sisters witnessed firsthand the disintegration of trust among the nobility, the military, and the court. Even those once loyal to the crown began to doubt the direction in which the empire was heading. As 1917 approached, the growing unrest transformed into open rebellion. The February Revolution was not a sudden explosion, but the culmination of years of systemic failures: military defeats, food shortages, labor strikes, and widespread disillusionment. When it finally erupted, the sisters were at Tsarskoye Selo, separated from the epicenters of revolution but not from its consequences. News came rapidly: mutinies in Petrograd, the Duma defying the Tsar, and the mass resignation of officials. The sisters, though young, understood the gravity of the situation. When Nicholas was forced to abdicate in March 1917, the empire their family had ruled for over 3 centuries collapsed in an instant. The shock was profound. They were no longer the imperial family. In that moment they became prisoners of history. The days following the abdication were marked by confusion and emotional turbulence. The sisters, along with their parents and younger brother Alexei, were placed under house arrest at the Alexander Palace. The transition was jarring. The staff was reduced, the mood subdued, and the routines they had known since childhood began to fray. At first, their confinement was cushioned by familiarity. They were still in their home, still attended by a few loyal retainers, still surrounded by the possessions that marked their former status. But the sense of impending danger grew daily. Guards patrolled the grounds. Letters were censored. Supplies became limited. And rumors swirled of mobs, uprisings, and violent reprisals against anyone connected to the old regime. In the midst of this uncertainty, the sisters clung to their religious faith, their familial bonds, and their sense of duty. They supported their mother, who was overwhelmed by grief and worry. They tried to maintain morale, caring for Alexei and keeping up the semblance of normalcy. They wrote in their diaries, recorded the changing seasons, read books, and played music. Yet beneath this routine lay a growing realization that their lives would never return to what they once were. The hope that the provisional government might restore some form of monarchy began to fade, replaced by the reality that they were being quietly erased from power. Later in 1917, the family was moved from Tsarskoye Selo to Tobolsky in Siberia, a relocation that further emphasized their fall from grace. The journey was long and cold, filled with uncertainty. Upon arrival, they were housed in the former governor's mansion, a far cry from the palatial halls of their youth. Their life grew increasingly austere. The sisters endured harsh winters, limited freedom, and the psychological strain of isolation. Letters from this period are filled with coded language and veiled sentiments, suggesting that they were aware their words were being read. Still, they tried to remain hopeful. They decorated Easter eggs, tended small gardens, and helped keep the household functioning. But the outside world continued to slip further away. As the Bolsheviks seized power in October 1917, the family situation became more precarious. Their names were erased from official records. Their former allies fled or were executed. Public opinion, once filled with awe and admiration, had turned to scorn or indifference. In April 1918, the Romanovs were again relocated, this time to Ekaterinburg. This final move was not just geographic, it marked the transition from house arrest to mortal peril. They were placed in the Ipatov house, ominously renamed the House of Special Purpose. The new regime, deeply suspicious of any potential for monarchical resurgence, viewed the family not as relics but as threats. Inside the Ipatov house, the sisters' lives grew bleaker. Windows were painted over. Letters ceased. Communication with the outside world was forbidden. Food was meager. Surveillance was constant. Yet even in these darkest moments, they showed remarkable courage and dignity. They continued to care for one another, maintained a routine of prayers and readings, and tried to remain calm in the face of the unknown. They embroidered, read spiritual texts, and found solace in their faith. It was during this time that they began sewing jewels into their clothing, both as a means of protection and in the faint hope of eventual escape. The end came in the early hours of July 17, 1918. Under orders from the Bolsheviks, the family was awakened and told they were being moved for their safety. Led to a basement room, the sisters stood alongside their parents and brother. The official explanation was brief. Without ceremony or trial, a group of guards opened fire. The execution was brutal and chaotic. The bullets did not immediately kill the sisters. The hidden jewels acted as armor, prolonging the horror. In the dim light, amid the smoke and confusion, each was eventually struck down by bullets and bayonets. Their lives, shaped by the grandeur of empire and tested by the tragedy of revolution, ended in violence and obscurity. For decades, the fate of the Romanovs remained clouded in mystery. The Soviet regime buried their story, denied responsibility, and suppressed evidence. Rumors circulated of survivors, imposters, and secret rescues. The most famous of these was Anna Anderson, who claimed to be Anastasia and captured the public imagination for years. But it wasn't until the fall of the Soviet Union that the truth began to emerge. In the 1990s, the remains of the Romanovs were discovered in a forest outside Ekaterinburg. Through DNA testing and extensive forensic analysis, most of the family was identified and given a formal burial in St. Petersburg's Peter and Paul Cathedral in 1998. Later, additional remains believed to be those of Alexei and one of the sisters, either Maria or Anastasia, were found and confirmed. The reburial was solemn, a final acknowledgement of lives once denied even the dignity of memory. For the Russian Orthodox Church and many across the world, the Romanov sisters were not merely victims of revolution, they were martyrs of faith and innocence. In 2000, the family was canonized as passion bearers by the Church, recognizing their suffering and spiritual endurance. The sisters, once icons of beauty, grace, and imperial splendor, came to represent something far more enduring: the quiet resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable change. Their story continues to fascinate because it speaks not only of privilege and power, but of loss, vulnerability, and the emotional awakening of four young women trapped in a history far larger than themselves. Through their letters, photographs, and the fragments of their lives that have survived, we see not just grand duchesses, but daughters, sisters, caregivers, and witnesses to a crumbling world. The tragedy of their end does not erase the grace with which they lived. It only deepens the poignancy of their journey from the splendor of the Winter Palace to the silence of a Siberian forest. In the Romanov sisters' final years, there is no clearer example of how history turns even the most protected lives into mirrors of an entire nation's transformation. They grew from girls of privilege into young women of strength. They watched an empire fall and met their fate not with complaint, but with quiet dignity. And in doing so, they left behind a legacy not of politics or power, but of grace, compassion, and a humanity that transcends time. The story of the Romanovs stretches beyond palace walls and centuries of imperial rule. Their disappearance, reappearance, and the enduring controversies over their deaths continue to captivate historians, spiritual believers, and the public alike. Central to their legacy is a profound interconnectedness between mystery, cultural memory, and historical reflection. Even after the Soviet Union collapsed, the precise fate of the Romanov family remained shrouded in uncertainty. For decades, rumors persisted that the Bolsheviks had carried out a cover-up, denying or obscuring the execution of Tsar Nicholas II, Empress Alexandra, their daughters and son in July 1918. It wasn't until 1979 that secret excavators discovered remains near Ekaterinburg, but political constraints kept the find secret until the early 1990s, when coordinated forensic investigations confirmed the identities of 9 individuals: the Tsar, Tsarina, 3 daughters, and 4 attendants. Yet doubts lingered. The bodies of 2 children, Alexei and 1 daughter, probably Maria or Anastasia, were missing from the 1991 sites. Their eventual discovery in 2007 and subsequent DNA validation in 2009 finally allowed all family members to be accounted for. Even after this breakthrough, controversy remained. The Russian Orthodox Church expressed reservations about the initial DNA work and has continued pursuing additional testing to fully endorse the remains. Meanwhile, conspiracy theories endured. Claims of Anastasia's survival persisted for nearly a century, fueled by claimants like Anna Anderson and a stream of cultural retellings, from memoirs to animated films and Broadway musicals. These stories tapped into a collective longing for innocence, escape, and hope that the Romanovs themselves symbolized for many. The Romanov sisters Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia held a particular place in collective imagination. Their beauty, youth, and personalities humanized a fallen empire. Their last days, clinging to each other in captivity, imbued their story with pathos and enduring relevance. As passion-bearers canonized by the Russian Orthodox Church, they occupy an ambiguous role, viewed as spiritual symbols of martyrdom, yet also as representatives of a historic system whose downfall they could not prevent. Even today, their final burial site remains unsettled. While the first 7 remains were interred in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg in 1998, the later found remains of Alexei and his sister await official entombment pending ongoing ecclesiastical review. Travelers visiting the Church on the Blood in Ekaterinburg, built on the execution site, encounter pilgrimages, mosaics, and memorials that reflect a nation still grappling with its past. Beyond the unresolved forensic questions lies the sisters' cultural legacy, a fusion of historical reality and myth. Their wartime nursing, diaries, and private photographs shifted public perception. Royalty no longer merely symbols of power, but empathetic individuals driven by service and suffering. Literary and media portrayals, fiction, art, documentary continue to explore them as icons of lost innocence, tragic youth, and the twilight of a fading world. In international memory, the sisters embody the complexity of the Russian Empire: grandeur mixed with fragility, tradition entangled with modernity, divine rule shadowed by mismanagement. Their lives and deaths prompt questions about historical agency. Did they share responsibility, or were they victims of circumstance? Could they have reshaped Russia's destiny? Their story remains both a historical case study and a canvas upon which subsequent generations project hopes, failures, and lessons. Ultimately, the Romanov legacy lies not only in verified facts, dates, graves, DNA, but also in the ongoing conversation they spark. Debate continues over scientific analysis, restitution, moral accountability, and cultural symbolism. But far more enduring is the sisters' shared humanity, for young women navigating privilege, constraint, affection, and oppression, only to strengthen their bond as the walls closed in. Perhaps their greatest lasting impact is emotional, a reminder of how ordinary virtues love, sacrifice, faith can echo through centuries and crosses. In Russia's cultural landscape they remain more than fallen nobility. They are witnesses through lived experience to the twilight of empire, the power of myth, and the persistence of memory. The legacy of the Romanov sisters Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia extends far beyond the confines of their short lives, lingering through history as a haunting testament to the final days of imperial Russia and the unrelenting power of personal narrative. Their story, born into unimaginable privilege and extinguished in abrupt and brutal tragedy, continues to fascinate not merely for the opulence of their upbringing or the cruelty of their end, but because it encapsulates a deeper, more universal human struggle between innocence and fate, power and vulnerability, history and myth. In the years following their execution, the world grappled with the shocking loss of the Romanovs. The absence of clear and immediate answers regarding their deaths only intensified public interest. For decades, the mystery surrounding their final moments bred speculation, imposters, and legends. It was perhaps inevitable that a society which had once idolized monarchy would be equally drawn to tales of survival and miraculous escape. These myths, particularly those surrounding Anastasia, found fertile ground not only in Russia but across the West, where fascination with fallen royalty persisted like an ember that refused to go out. In literature, theater, and film, these imagined continuations of life offered comfort, entertainment, and a seductive what-if narrative, even while the truth remained buried literally and figuratively. Eventually, with the discovery of the mass grave in Ekaterinburg and the application of DNA testing decades later, the historical record began to overtake the legends. The scientific confirmation of their deaths did not diminish the sisters' symbolic power. Instead, it gave clarity to their martyrdom, framing them not as lingering ghosts of empire but as individuals, young women who had lived, worked, suffered, and died not as figureheads but as daughters and sisters caught in a world collapsing beneath them. Through their diaries and letters, we come to understand them not as relics of an outdated dynasty, but as complex, intelligent, emotional people who sought to hold their family together in the face of encroaching darkness. Their personal correspondence reveals a shared resilience, a collective emotional depth, and a steady moral compass that shines through their otherwise cloistered existence. In the pages of these writings, we see Olga's introspective melancholy, Tatiana's composed sense of duty, Maria's gentle heart, and Anastasia's wit and mischief. They were not simply archetypes of nobility or symbols of innocence lost. They were real, multifaceted individuals shaped by love, faith, privilege, and profound limitations. It is in this humanity that their enduring relevance lies. Despite the world around them growing increasingly unstable and hostile, the sisters maintained their compassion, their devotion to one another, and their unwavering sense of dignity. Their legacy also serves as a lens through which the modern world can better understand the complexity of the Russian Empire during its final days. The Romanov sisters were born into a world built on hierarchies and assumptions of divine right, where autocracy reigned and reform was feared. Yet they lived long enough to see the fragility of that structure exposed by war, revolution, and the rise of new ideologies. They experienced firsthand the consequences of isolation, misinformation, and political miscalculation. While they themselves held no direct power, their lives were emblematic of the tension between tradition and modernity, loyalty and disillusionment, security and upheaval. Even now, a century later, their influence endures subtle yet widespread. Their images, captured in sepia-toned photographs, continue to circulate as icons of tragic beauty. Their names remain familiar not only to scholars of Russian history but to countless readers and viewers who have encountered their stories in books, documentaries, or adaptations. The Romanov sisters have inspired countless works of fiction, historical inquiry, visual art, and even musical tributes, each reinterpreting their lives through the prism of contemporary values and concerns. Moreover, their story remains a cautionary tale about power and the illusions it fosters. For all their elegance and education, the Romanovs as a family failed to recognize the mounting pressures of their time until it was too late. This miscalculation had fatal consequences not only for themselves but for millions of Russians whose fates were shaped by the revolutions and repressions that followed. In this sense, the sisters' narrative is inextricable from the broader tragedy of the Russian people in the 20th century. Their deaths mark a symbolic end to an era, a moment in which one world died and another, harsher one was born. Yet perhaps the most lasting element of their legacy is the quiet nobility with which they faced their fate. In their final months and days, under guard, stripped of rank, influence and comfort, the sisters did not break. They found solace in each other, remained committed to their faith, and preserved what fragments of normalcy they could. Their strength, though born of privilege, was tested in ways that few could endure. That they met such suffering without bitterness speaks to a character that transcends station or circumstance. The Romanov sisters' lives represent the tragic intersection of youth, duty, innocence and history. They were born into a world already poised for transformation, and they perished in its violent birth pangs. Yet their story survives not merely because of their bloodline, but because of their humanity. The world remembers them not only as grand duchesses but as symbols of lost grace and the enduring power of familial love amid chaos. As long as people seek to understand the past through the lens of the personal, the Romanov sisters will remain figures of fascination, mourning, and profound empathy. Their legacy reminds us that behind every great historical event are individual lives, quietly enduring the full weight of history's force.